He was the dominant personality in a half-century of civil rights litigation in his native state. He was best known for his quest to achieve equal educational opportunity for all, especially the children of color. How successful his efforts and how profound his frustrations. The life and times of another man who believed in a place called hope, coming up on Arkansas Week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. It was an extraordinary life, John Walker's. Born at Hope in poverty, he struggled against discrimination to earn a law degree at Yale, then returned to Arkansas and began a 50-year practice devoted mainly in service to the scorned and the underserved, and especially their children. Equal economic opportunity was impossible without equal educational opportunity, said John Walker. And in one courtroom after another, one decade after another, that is what he demanded. 51 years ago, having taken up the cause of school desegregation, John Walker would strike the theme that would be his lifelong, and not only in Little Rock.
For 14 years now, approximately, various boards of education and individuals within that board or who are on that board have sought ways to evade the full meaning and the full import of the Brown v. Board of Education decision decided in 1954. There have been an outright defiance on a number of cases. And as long as a school district has a responsibility for teaching respect for law and respect for order, it certainly has a responsibility to set an example. And I certainly think that this school district certainly has not set an example for law obedience during the past 14 years.
Adored by some, anathema to others. Our focus tonight, the life and times of John Walker. Philip Kaplan joined John Walker in what was Arkansas's first racially integrated law firm. The shingle and the stationery changed when Richard Mays became a third partner. As a Little Rock School Board member and later the district superintendent, Baker Curris was a Walker defendant. And Vivian Flowers of Pine Bluff, an attorney and a grandniece of an earlier African-American legal legend, Harold Flowers, was John Walker's seatmate in the Arkansas House of Representatives. Thank you, all four of us, for being with us for this program. Phil Kaplan, let's start with you. John Walker, who was he?
Well, as you have already said, to different people, he was a different person. To those of us who practiced with him, he was clearly an outstanding lawyer. I would say brilliant. I would say that in all more than the 50 years I've practiced, he was probably the best on his feet in a courtroom. Without any preparation at all, he could take on a witness and make that witness, even though that individual was from on the other side, he'd make him his own witness by turning him into an advocate for John's position. So I'd say he clearly was what other people thought of him who were more fond of him, and that he was a brilliant lawyer.
Richard Mays, there was a passion that burned inside John Walker, but he kept it pretty much contained. His dealings with in the courtroom and outside, he had, at least it was a veneer, anyway, of calm. Maintain the civility, it seemed to me.
John was able to be disagreeable, to disagree without being disagreeable. He had a mannerism. In fact, I was struck by the comments that a former basketball coach, Nolan Richardson, referenced John as silk. He was very smooth, and he could zero in on the issues that were important to him. In the practice, he always understood he needed a record because he was always thinking about his appellate relief. And he was probably one of his greatest qualities was his tenacity. He was going to keep coming at you, and you wouldn't think he was that tenacious, but if you were the butt of his challenge, after a period of time, you would say, well, doesn't he get tired?
Baker Curris, I don't think you would doubt his tenacity. Mr. Walker's.
No, I wouldn't. You know, I was on the school board 12 years, and he sued me numerous times in my official capacity,
Right.
I might say, and then likewise when I was superintendent. But I never took it personally. He never attacked me personally. In fact, we got along quite well privately. Always a gentleman, as has been said, always calm, never a screamer, which do we ever need that influence today? I hope people remember that John accomplished so much without screaming at people, without losing his temper, and without being intemperate. He was tenacious, as good as I ever saw at exploiting a weakness in a case. And he cast a long shadow, which I think will continue to be influential as we go forward. I hope so.
And Representative Vivian Flowers, you did not need a John Walker to grant you a legacy. You had one from your great uncle, or granduncle, but at the same time, John Walker may have added to it, or?
Well, and so I wanted to correct, I'm not an attorney, that's my cousin Stephanie Flowers, but his influence was multifaceted in my life because our families shared a friendship in different ways, and John Walker was provided my father with legal representation in a discrimination case, and so I got to know him then. Then I attended the inauguration of President Bill Clinton because of him. I was friends with his daughter. His daughter and I are still friends. And at that event, they started playing Dixie, and he shut that down real quick. And then many years later, I would be working at UAMS as the director for recruitment at the Center for Diversity Affairs and later COO. And I would find myself on the other side of the table in a lawsuit. And experienced that, and then he was my seatmate in the House. And in all of those experiences, I learned a great deal from this man who I saw as the father of a friend and was later a colleague, and in between time, an incredible advocate for people and for justice.
You had the same goals, Phil Kaplan, you and John Walker. You had the same goals, but at times later in your legal careers, you were adversaries in the courtroom.
On at least two significant cases, the Nolan Richardson case, where he represented Coach Richardson and I represented the university. And then there was a discrimination case against Walmart for a class of drivers, and I was lead counsel for Walmart in that case. So yes, we were adversaries in later, not too many other times, just really those two, but that was enough.
Here, I guess, is the question that we want to address in this broadcast anyway, about the life and times of John Walker. Are we in better times because of John Walker? Richard Mays.
Oh, I think absolutely. When you deal with and address the issues that were the focus of the challenge, the challenges that we were facing in society, equal education, equal employment opportunity, the 1965 and 64 Civil Rights Acts, which provided real vehicles to make changes, and changes were made. You have to remember, Walker, we were suing the state, the city, the utilities, the banks.
He sued pretty much everybody.
The police.
Everybody.
The police, you name it. And part of the reason probably why we ultimately went our separate ways is because we conquered many of those challenges and then tended to find other interest in our lives and pursue them.
Baker Curtis.
Well, you know, John was influential in education, and the book's still incomplete. We really don't know where we're going. Although I will say, if you look at major school litigation across this country, Little Rock is probably in a better place than so many other cities that have had protracted litigation. And of course, it remains to be seen at this troubled time we're in this day, where Little Rock School District ends up. But John always fought for kids that had great need. There was no doubt that his heart was in the work, and he pushed in the right direction when it came for that.
Well, he was I think it's fair to say, the white establishment, certainly in the early 60s, the mid 60s, into the 70s, 80s, and even today. So many of the white corporate establishment, the old Fifth Ward Little Rock group. Well, all of Little Rock say, Mr. Walker, why don't you drop it? You are resegregating Little Rock, the Little Rock schools. Phil Kaplan.
Well, I don't think that John ever thought that what he was doing was to diminish education in Little Rock. Remember, in 1982, several years after the firm broke up, I, together with Les Hollingsworth and Janet Pulliam, represented the Little Rock School District in the initiation of that school case that still goes on. John was not a part of that case. He joined that case several years after that, representing what was then the Joshua interveners. Remember, Judge Woods sort of consolidated the school districts, everything south of the river and everything north of the river. The Eighth Circuit reversed that, unfortunately. I think that that was an unfortunate decision. And by the time John got into the case with the interveners, it was in a much different position. The district at that point decided it wanted to make certain that there was an effective remedy. So there was a dramatic change in the way the district viewed the litigation. It said, well, look, let's put an end to the litigation now. Unfortunately, here we are in 2019. There's not an end to the litigation. But I don't think that that John ever took the position, look, I'm trying to somehow diminish or ruin the district. I think his efforts were always, look, I want every single child in this district to have an equal opportunity and an equal advantage.
Yeah, well, nobody, I don't think, questioned his intent, at least in that regard. Baker Curtis?
Well, you know, the socioeconomic factors that have led to segregation in so many southern cities are endemic in our society. John didn't create those. He faced them just like we do. I talked to him at great length about the value of an integrated education, and there were points when I discussed that with him where I think he had resigned himself to the fact that so many people had gone, it was almost impossible to integrate our city, integrate our Little Rock School District. And Phil's exactly right. Little Rock brought that case in order to maintain integrated education. That was the force of the case. And I think at some point John got frustrated with so many people leaving that he had a client. I mean, as a lawyer, he had a client or a class of clients that he had to represent, and that's what he did. And the other thing people forget is that every time we were back in court after that case was settled, it was to parse the settlement agreement entered voluntarily by the school district and the other parties. John didn't force anything on anybody. Mm-hmm. It was a settled case with a contractual settlement. about which there was a great deal of disagreement. But you can't lay this on the foot of John Walker, really.
Yeah, Vivian Flo.
Yeah, I don't believe that there's any one element that anyone could point out and, as you say, lay the state of the school district or school districts really across the state at the foot of John Walker. Quite the opposite. I think that, one thing he did, and I think we watched a clip of him talking about or challenging the Little Rock School District to follow the law. And so when we look at the dynamics then during the Central High crisis and before, when we look at the dynamics in between and when we look at the dynamics now, it's very similarly situated with regard to the socioeconomic issues that are going to drive where kids are. And then when you look at the division of resources and really the racism that is involved in keeping things the way they are, how in the world would we draw attention to someone advocating to say, hey, school district, follow the law, be intentional about making things different, because we see that that school district or we as a state or society are failing, follow the law. When people turn around and say, well, things haven't changed after all of this time, when those same folks have been in position to make changes with regard to housing, poverty, and all of those things that impact what really happens in school districts, I say that he has made a great difference in challenging us to follow the law, adhere to the Constitution, state and federal. The question is, what are we going to do to ensure that at some point that happens?
That, Richard, well, everyone, but Mr. Mays, that had to be an incredible frustration to your former law partner, Mr. Walker, because he was in fact not just battling the statute books, de facto or de jure anyway, but he was doing battle with social forces, cultural forces, doing battle really with history.
And I think that's always been a major challenge. But if I remember correctly, the suit that Phil is talking about, he and Les Hollingsworth filed suit against the other school districts
And the state.
Alleging that their practices caused a disproportionate adverse impact on the Little Rock School District.
State rolled over.
And Judge Woods appointed an advisory committee. I was on that advisory committee. I don't know what we did with Hillary Clinton, and I think there were two other members of the advisory committee to kind of advise Judge Woods from a citizen's perspective on the challenges. When I think John intervened in that suit, and the problem is you can't control how people respond and react to the challenges of school desegregation, and part of the lack of success in the process, because I see us going to some extent in circles, part of the lack of success is that people were always trying to ultimately avoid the bottom line, and that was a complete assimilation of a diverse population in that school district trying to get an education, because people had moved sometimes to other parts of the district to avoid that assimilation. And all of the policy people, Walker, the challenge of trying to predict behavior or change the cultural behavior of folks who, for whatever reason, just resisted the integration effort is probably the greatest frustration, not only of Walker, but of all of the various districts that had to meet that challenge.
Well, it frustrated the bench as well. Judge Woods eventually tossed it.
He finally gave it up. But, you said that the state rolled over. It rolled over after a while.
Yeah.
But now, you look at what the state's position is now, and are they in a better, or are they somebody who is trying to really undermine? And I think when you look at what the proponents of public education in Little Rock talk about with regard to charter schools, what Baker Curris himself made a big deal out of and was very vociferous about charter schools and these highways that are being made even more lanes to help people get quicker out of Little Rock and into other districts. I mean, that's the responsibility of the state. So they may have done things at one time and say, oh, we're going to give you this bunch of money, but now look at where they are and what they are doing to sort of undermine, not sort of, I think clearly, undermine the ability of the Little Rock School District to thrive and to provide a good education for blacks and whites. This is, I mean, we've got to look at this whole picture and what all of the elements in our government are doing. I mean, Baker took positions that were ultimately detrimental to his ability to continue. And so what did the state do? They said goodbye to Mr. Curris. They didn't like what he was saying.
If I could point out, you mentioned something about it's not just about black and white students, and the other thing is not just about Little Rock either. First of all, in terms of looking at the legacy and the career and the voice of John Walker, and I remember the remarks you said, Mr. Kaplan, at the services today. You talked about how there was not only a lawsuit and a Central High crisis. Part of your legal strategy was to sue every school to ensure that they followed the law and integrated where they could students and the faculty of those schools. And so when we look at where we are now, we have to not only look at what's happening in Little Rock, we also need to look at what's happening in Pine Bluff and in other jurisdictions to see the pattern. And so now you have private institutions determining what happens politically to the detriment of the system. At the end of the day, the schools are suffering as it relates to the children and the students. And I think that if we're going to look at this, to your point, whether we're examining the record and the impact of John Walker to say, you know, what has happened to benefit schools, it's statewide. And when we look at what's happening now in terms of charter schools, in terms of unions representing teachers, in terms of test scores, the measures that we're using, there is a pattern. It's not just happening in Little Rock. And at the end of the day, if we are to improve what happens to black students, it is going to positively impact all students. Likewise, if we don't do anything and we continue to let this spiral out of control and decline, and we lose our students, whether it's losing them to other states or losing them in our own communities, the same thing is happening and will happen in white communities as well.
Well, Richard Mays, John Walker saw all of this. He was more than obviously.
I think public education is the fundamental equalizer in our society, and John surely appreciated the value of public education. And if we lose the support of public education, which if we let our public schools become racially identifiable, the support for public education is going to diminish, and the quality of education and opportunity that we provide our citizens will substantially be adversely affected. I think John fully understood the value of public education and the emphasis and the need to shore that up. And you can't, if you let those schools even now become racially identifiable, the support base for public education is going to be adversely affected substantially, and the quality of the education provided for those in public education is going to be affected.
We are going to call, throw the flag just for a second, or call time just for a second, because our over-the-air broadcast has ended. Our time is up. But we have a little more time left on the World Wide Web, so we are going to take a break. thank those of you who are watching us over the air and invite you to join us on the AETN website, and we'll continue this conversation then. Thanks very much.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.